Story 1.
I never imagined that a simple consultation with the dentist could turn into the nightmare that I will describe. It all started on a night that I will never be able to forget, when I decided to solve that boring pain in the tooth that was bothering me weeks. My appointment was scheduled for a strange time, almost dawn, something around 3:33 a.m. The office was in an old building in the city center, of these places that seem to have stories behind the peeled walls and the smell of mold. When I entered the office, I already felt something strange. The atmosphere was different from what I expected, with yellowish lighting and all looking a little abandoned. The dentist was an old man, looking about 60 years old, with a look that made me uncomfortable from the first moment. His movements were slow and accurate, as if they were used to doing that thousands of times. As I settled in my chair, I began to notice the details around me, trying to distract my mind from the fear I always felt from dentists. That's when I began to look more closely at the instruments. Something really caught my attention. The equipment was visibly dirty, with dark spots that seemed to be dry blood scattered throughout surgical instruments. I tried to disguise my nervousness, but my whole body began to shake involuntarily. The spots were old, with a brownish color that contrasted terribly with the metal of the instruments, as if several people had been served there without any cleaning. The dentist did not seem to care about the state of the instruments. His movements were mechanical, almost robotic, and he showed no concern about the dirty appearance of the equipment. I realized that his eyes did not blink properly, and there was something strange in the way he stared at me. It was an empty look, as if he were seeing me. But at the same time, he won't see me. The chair creaked as he approached, and I felt a chilling by walking my spine, something telling me that it was not a normal appointment. The tension in the environment was palpable, and I was increasingly restless. My eyes could not stop circulating through the office, observing every morbid detail. The walls had dark spots that seemed to breathe something, and there were a number of instruments hanging from rusty hooks that made me imagine the worst things. The smell was different, a mixture of alcohol, oxidized metal, and something I couldn't identify. While the dentist prepared the instruments, I noticed something even more disturbing. Several strange marks on the walls, such as scratches and risks that seemed to have been made by human nails. They were irregular strokes, some deeper, some more superficial, scattered at different times, as if someone had desperately tried to escape that place. My heart began to beat faster, and a feeling of panic began to overcome me. I really wanted to get up and leave, but something arrested me there, as if some invisible force prevented me from moving. The dentist began to prepare the instruments, and each movement of his seemed calculated and slow. Her hands trembled slightly, but in a way that didn't seem to be because of her age. It was as if he were controlling something, a kind of contained tremor. I realized that most instruments were covered by a layer of dry blood, with different spots, some older, some newer. This made me question how many people really went by and under what conditions. I tried to ask a question, but my voice was embargoed, almost a whisper. The dentist did not answer, continued to work as if I did not exist. His eyes were fixed to some distant point, something I couldn't see. The room was so silent that I could hear my own panting breath, mixed with the slight metallic sound of the instruments shocking. That's when I noticed that there was no external sound, no noise from the street, no noise from other people. It was as if we were completely isolated from the outside world. Suddenly, the dentist took one of the blood-stained instruments and began to approach my face. His movements were so accurate that they seemed rehearsed, as if he had already done that hundreds of times. I wanted to scream, but no sounds came out. My body looked frozen in the chair, completely immobilized, and I could only feel the sweat running down my forehead. The instruments were so close to my face that I could see every stain, every dry blood brand, every little detail that made me tremble with fear. The worst was his look, a completely empty look, as if I were not a person, but just another object in that room. Her eyes not flashed, showed no emotion, no trace of humanity. It was as if it were being observed by something that was not human. something that was there only to fulfill a specific purpose. The temperature of the room had fallen dramatically, and I felt every hair of my body shiver as if something supernatural was about to happen. I don't know how long I was in that position, completely paralyzed. My mind trying to sue what was going on, but it was as if my thoughts were slowly. The dirty blood instruments were still close to my face, and I could smell the metallic and put rolled from them emanating from them. It was a visceral odor that made me want to close my eyes and wake up from that nightmare. But something prevented me from moving, as if some supernatural force had taken over my body. The dentist was still immovable, holding the instrument near my face. His eyes did not blink, they did not move. It was as if he were a living statue. The silence was deafening, and I could hear my own heart beating so hard that it seemed to explode at any moment. Something was wrong there, something I couldn't explain, something that went far beyond a simple dental consultation. It was as if that moment had frozen in time, and I was stuck in some kind of nightmare I couldn't escape. I don't know how long it happened, but suddenly, something has changed in the environment. The dentist began to make a very slow, almost imperceptible movement, as if preparing for something. His hands, once completely stopped, began to tremble in a way that seemed unnatural to me. The dirty blood instruments made a low noise, almost a metallic whisper, each time he moved them. I was still completely immobilized, my heavy body as if it had been connected to that chair by invisible currents. The worst was that feeling that something was about to happen, something I couldn't understand or predict. The office seemed to have become a completely different place, where the normal rules of reality no longer worked. The sounds were strange, stuffy, as if we were inside a bubble completely isolated from the outside world. My breathing was increasingly panting, and I felt my body covered with a layer of cold sweat that was slowly dripped. I don't know how, but at that moment I realized that something truly supernatural was happening. It was as if time had stopped, and I was stuck in a nightmare I couldn't escape. Blood-stained instruments seemed to come to a living of their own, and the dentist kept looking at me in that empty and disturbing way. My body was still completely immobilized, as if some invisible force had arrested me to that chair. Every second seemed to last eternity, and I felt that something terrible was about to happen. Suddenly, everything just stopped. The dentist froze in the same position, the suspended instruments in the air, and the silence became even more intense. In the following second, everything returned to normal as if nothing had happened. I managed to move, looked around, and the office was perfectly clean, organized, with no sign of the bloodstains or strange scratches on the walls. The dentist smiled normally, as if nothing had happened, and asked if I was okay. I didn't know what to answer. I tried to rationalize what had happened, but it was impossible to find a logical explanation. A week passed, and that experience continued to haunt me. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw those blood-stained instruments, that dentist's empty look, that feeling of being completely paralyzed. I couldn't sleep properly, always woke up in the middle of the night sweating cold, reliving those terrible moments. My mind couldn't sue if it had been real or just a nightmare. Today, whenever I pass through that building in the center of the city, I feel a shiver running my spine. I never tried to know who that dentist was. I never returned to that office. Today, years later, I still find myself thinking about that bizarre consultation. I don't seek more answers. I just carry with me the certainty that there are things in the world we can't explain. That night at 3:33 in the morning will be forever recorded in my memory. An unresolved mystery, a moment that completely changed my perception of reality. And every time I hear the noise of metallic instruments, I feel that same shiver by walking my spine.
If you like our stories, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. Story 2.
I've never been one to believe in these stories about supernatural things or strange phenomena, but what happened to me that day at the dentist's office? I still can't quite explain it. It all started like a normal visit, you know? I was just there for a routine appointment. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. But when the dentist started to adjust the chair, something strange happened. the light above me, the one that normally illuminates the entire office, began to shine brighter than usual. I thought it was a problem with the lamp, but I soon realized that it wasn't just that. The light seemed too intense, blinding in a way that didn't make sense. I tried to look away, but it was impossible. I was becoming more blind by the second. What really made me paranoid was when I realized I couldn't move. At first, I thought it was just the uncomfortable position of the chair, but soon the discomfort turned into a feeling of paralysis. I felt my body tense, as if I were trapped there, and with every attempt to move, it felt like something was holding me back, as if I were part of that chair. The sound of light, a constant and annoying hum, filled the room. It wasn't a normal noise. It was like the light was trying to suffocate me somehow. My vision became blurry, and that's when I noticed the shadow. Something was approaching me, but I couldn't see what it was. The dentist was still there, but his face was completely obscured by the light, and I couldn't see anything but a blur. The worst thing, however, was the feeling that I was not alone, or something watching me. I tried to focus, try to understand what was happening, but the more I tried, the more everything seemed to fall apart around me. The room seemed to close in, the feeling that the walls were closing in on me. It was as if the air was thicker, as if I couldn't breathe properly. My heart raced, and I broke out in a cold sweat, fear taking over. But the worst was the cold, a cold that came from within, as if something cold was spreading through my veins. It was no ordinary cold. It was deep, like he was being touched by something that shouldn't be there. I was so tense, I could barely feel my muscles. All I felt was that tightness, a feeling that at any moment I would disappear there, in that chair. And that's when I felt something was approaching me, but in a wrong way. It was not a physical movement, but something that seemed to pass through light. The shadow that formed had no shape. I tried to open my eyes as wide as possible, straining my vision, but the more I tried, the more everything became blurred. It was as if the light was distorting everything around me. The figure in front of me seemed fuzzy. I couldn't tell if it was a human being, an object, or something completely out of the ordinary. She was there, but at the same time, she wasn't. I didn't know if it was just my fear making me see things, but a part of me knew it wasn't normal. My mind was in shambles. I just wanted it to end. I wanted to get out of there, but I couldn't. The feeling of being observed, studied, as if I were the target of something unknown, that paralyzed me even more. I could only hear the buzzing of that light, getting stronger and stronger, almost as if it were inside my head. The feeling that something was there, watching me, wouldn't go away. It was as if time was standing still, but I couldn't escape that feeling. I started to question whether this was all really happening, whether it was real. Was he having a mental breakdown? Or was there really something there with that strange presence, watching my every move? My breathing became heavy, and I could barely keep my eyes open with the light so bright. What terrified me most, besides not knowing what was happening, was the feeling of helplessness. I couldn't move. I was completely trapped, as if everything around me had become an invisible trap. When I finally managed to open my eyes a little wider, something bizarre happened. The shadow, which previously seemed undefined, suddenly took a shape. I don't know how to describe it, but it felt like the light was distorting, as if it was trying to give shape to something that shouldn't have shape. It was as if the figure in front of me was slowly materializing, but at the same time, its presence seemed to expand, taking up more and more space. It was a horrible feeling, as if everything I knew about reality was being ripped apart and reshaped before me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask for help, but my voice wouldn't come out. I was so paralyzed by fear that I couldn't do anything. I just watched as it happened, unable to escape or understand what was happening. The light, which had previously been just dazzling, now seemed to pulse. The intensity varied, but always with the same feeling of suffocation. My entire body was shaking, and I didn't know if I was feeling cold, hot, or just in a state of pure panic. I was there, motionless, staring at that shape that now seemed clearer. She was in front of me, but at the same time, the feeling that she was behind me, on all sides, wouldn't leave me alone. Something inside me started screaming at me to get up, run, get away, but the words didn't seem to make sense. There was no escape possible. The chair, the light, the presence. Prison with no escape. In a moment, the shadow came even closer, until it was almost touching me. The air around me seemed to compress, and for a second, I felt like something was about to touch my face. My stomach turned, like a chill was running up my spine and into my neck. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I felt like I was being scrutinized by that thing, like I was being judged for something that didn't make any sense. The feeling that something was out of place invaded me, and everything seemed to blend together. My brain desperately tried to understand what was happening, but the confusion only increased. Worst of all was the absolute silence. There was no more sound, just the buzzing that seemed to come from inside me. It was as if I had been transported to another place, a reality that made no sense at all. I don't know how much time has passed, but the sense of time was completely distorted. I was starting to feel disoriented, not knowing if I had been trapped in that place for minutes or hours. The light was still there, pulsing and distorting everything around me, and that presence was still there. I could no longer distinguish what was real and what was imagination. My hands were sweaty, and I felt my heart beating so hard that it felt like it was going to come out of my chest. Fear gripped me like never before. I just wanted to leave, but I was completely paralyzed. With each second, the feeling of being watched, scrutinized, became more intense. Then, suddenly, something happened. The light began to dim. It wasn't a blackout. It wasn't something gradual. Simply, the intensity decreased until I could finally open my eyes without pain. And the figure, which had previously been right in front of me, simply disappeared. Everything was silent. I was panting. My body was sweaty and completely tense. The chair looked normal again. The office seemed more normal, as if nothing had happened. I looked around, hoping to see some explanation, but there was nothing. The dentist was still there, but he seemed as oblivious to what had happened as I was. I stood there, frozen, not knowing if it had really happened or if it was all just a hallucination. What torments me to this day is that I have never been able to understand what happened. And the worst part, I never went back to the dentist again. The strangest thing of all is that, after that day, nothing else happened. The feeling of being watched, that presence, the light, simply disappeared, as if they had never existed. I tried to get back to my routine, but something inside me wouldn't let me get rid of that fear. Whenever I close my eyes, I still feel that feeling of helplessness, of being trapped somewhere where the rules of reality don't apply. And the most disturbing thing is that I could never explain what happened. It wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't an optical illusion, and no one around me seemed to understand what I went through. I know what I experienced. I know what I felt. But in the end, what scares me most is the idea that it just happened and then stopped, without reason, without explanation. That day at the dentist's office still haunts me. As much as I've tried to rationalize, as much as I've searched for answers, none of them make sense. The fear I felt, the feeling that something was watching me, never fully went away. Sometimes I wonder if, somehow, I'm still being watched, if it's really over, or if it's just a pause, waiting to happen again, and I don't know what to do with it. I just know that since that day, I have never been the same. I've never looked at a dentist chair the same way again. And honestly, I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened. And maybe that's what scares me the most. I have no answers. And, to this day, I don't know if I want to know.
If you like our stories, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. Story 3.
I never imagined that a simple day of consultation at the dentist could turn into something so disturbing. I was in the waiting room, waiting for my turn to enter. It was a small clinic, nothing special, and the atmosphere was quiet, as always. When my name was called, I entered the room and settled in the chair. That feeling of common discomfort of those who will make a routine appointment. The dentist, a man of about 40 and in years, seemed quiet. He greeted me quickly and soon began to examine my mouth. So far, that's fine. That's when I started hearing the screams. At first, I thought it was some child's joke, but the screams were not normal. They seemed desperate, as if someone were really panicked. They came from a room next door, where there was no one, or at least no one visible. I was tense, and I know the dentist noticed, because he stopped for a moment and looked toward the wall, but then simply continued what he was doing. I thought, okay, maybe it's normal here, but as the screams increased, I couldn't ignore. It was as if someone was asking for help so desperately that even the air in the room seemed to tighten. And he kept working without saying a word about the sounds. The screams did not stop, and the feeling of discomfort in the room increased every second. It was strange, because the dentist showed no sign of concern. He was completely focused on my treatment, as if nothing was happening. I looked at the door of the room next door, trying to understand where those sounds were coming from, but couldn't see anything. It seemed that the wall was drowning, but still, the screams were clear, as if someone were really suffering. I didn't know if I wondered or pretended to be listening, but that dentist's silence made me even more agonized. He was so immersed in what he was doing, as if it were completely normal to hear someone scream for help beside. I thought to ask to leave, but I knew it would look strange, so I tried to calm down and focus on what he was doing. But it didn't give it. The screams were increasingly higher and closer. It was then that an idea began to form in my head. A very bad idea. What if that room beside it was empty? What if the dentist knew exactly what was going on, but was ignoring for some reason? That idea was like a weight on me, a pressure on the chest that was not passing. I could no longer focus on the appointment. I wanted to scream for help, but I couldn't. That silence of his, combined with the muffled screams, made me think that perhaps it was not a simple consultation. Something was very wrong there. I could no longer stop thinking about the idea that the dentist could know what was going on and was just ignoring. It bothered me deeply. With each scream, my body became more tense, and I felt a growing urge to get out of there, but I couldn't move. I stayed there, stuck in the chair, my eyes fixed on the door of the living room, waiting for someone or something to break that uncomfortable silence. The dentist seemed to be oblivious to everything around, as if that environment were totally normal. How could he be so insensitive? It was like I was in a nightmare, where everyone around me were pretending that nothing was happening, and I didn't know what to do, until the screams suddenly stopped. Deadly silence took over the clinic, and the only thing I could hear was the sound of my rapid breathing. I stayed there, waiting for the dentist to say something, but he didn't say a word. He just finished what he was doing in my mouth, as if nothing had happened. That sense of discomfort became a deep anguish, something I couldn't understand. Why did he not mention anything about the screams? Why didn't he tell me anything? There was no explanation, no sign that it was something unusual for him. When he finished, he handed me a glass of water and told me to wait in the waiting room until the secretary calls me to schedule the next appointment. I was in shock, not knowing what to say or do. My mind was a whirlwind, and I just wanted to get out of it as soon as possible. As I drove to the door, a strange sensation took over me. I don't know if it was fear or something else, but I couldn't help but feel that something was very wrong in that place. When I opened the door, the sound of the clinic seemed normal, but what made me stop was the receptionist's gaze. She was there, behind the counter, but her eyes were fixed on me with an expression I couldn't understand. It was as if she knew exactly what had happened, but she was trying to hide. I went to the counter, a little stunned, and tried to ask about the screams, but something prevented me from talking. The woman stared at me for a second, and then, with a almost inaudible voice, she said, "Don't worry about it. This is not your account." That answer froze me inside. What do you mean it wasn't my account? What was happening in that place? I left the clinic without looking back. feeling that every step, the weight of that experience, increased. What really scares me to this day is that even after all that happened, I could never understand what happened in that appointment. Why did the screams stop so abruptly? What did the dentist and receptionist know? I tried to go back to the clinic a few weeks later to look for answers. But when I got there, I found the door closed. There was a poster saying that the clinic was under renovation, but something told me that that explanation was not enough. I still wonder, to this day, what happened that day and what those shouts really meant. After that, I couldn't get that day out of my head. I kept thinking about the questions that were never answered, the things I couldn't understand. I went to the clinic several times just to check if it was still there, if any detail would have changed. In one of these visits, someone told me that the clinic had closed forever, but they didn't give me more explanations. I knew something was not right. But the strange thing is that I never heard of that clinic anywhere. No one else seemed to remember her. I went to the building a few weeks later, but the place looked empty, without traces of any activity there, as if it had never existed. That feeling that something had been erased from the collective memory made me even more restless. It was as if reality itself was trying to convince me that I had imagined everything. I never tried to know what happened in that clinic, nor did I try to understand what those shouts really meant. Sometimes the memory turns me, and I keep thinking about the dentist, the receptionist, and those voices, which seem more real with each passing day. I only know that since that day, I have never been the same, and to this day, I can't forget the screams. They still echo in my mind, and I wonder if anyone else heard. The scariest of all is that I could never understand why. That day, no one did anything to help.